Since I've been at Swarthmore, I've observed the college often referencing our Quaker heritage to invoke such values as equality, peace, and inclusion. For example, in a recent email, Val Smith wrote, "Our Quaker heritage has grounded us in nonviolent inquiry and action, where all voices are free to be heard. We must promote our values of inclusion and equality." Indeed, the dominant history about Quakers is a progressive one that praises Quakers for playing, quote, prominent roles in almost every major reform movement in American history, including abolition, African American rights, Indian rights, women's rights, prison reform, humane treatment of the mentally ill, and temperance. However, there's a lot that the dominant story leaves out. In fact, some scholars posit that most Quakers largely lived according to the values of whiter society. One such value? The belief in white Euro-Christian supremacy that justified dispossessing Native Americans of their land and their lives, and provided the justification for enacting cultural genocide through forced assimilation. Yes, the shocking truth is that Quakers were deeply involved in the forced assimilation of Native Americans through Indian schools, boarding schools in particular. Paula Palmer has identified about 30 Quaker Indian schools that operated between 1796 and 2006. That's only a few years short of the U.S.'s entire history. The height of Quaker involvement was between the years 1869 and 1877, when Quakers proposed and participated in carrying out a federal law called the Peace Policy, also known as the Quaker Policy due to their enthusiasm. This policy stipulated that church-run agencies would Christianize the native tribes and eradicate their culture and religion through the removal of children from reservation settings to boarding schools. The federal government transported at least 830,000 American Indian children to off-reservation boarding schools. That's equal to the population of San Francisco in 2013. It was under this law that Quakers managed 25 of these infamous Indian boarding schools and attempted to eradicate their culture. Quakers saw an education of deculturalization as a way to civilize and eventually Christianize the indigenous people. Civilizing involved changing everything about the native people's way of life, by any means necessary. As Quaker agent Joseph Webster put it, the whole character of the Indian must be changed. Native children were separated from their homes and communities and placed in off-reservation dorms modeled after a military setting. Parents were forced to send their children to these schools because Quaker agents would withhold goods provided for them in treaties, which amounted to threatening them with starvation until the parents consented. The idea was that the younger the children were, the more moldable they were. Forcing the children away to boarding schools, as Quaker Rainer Kelsey more bluntly states, would prevent a lapse hopelessly into the old shiftless savage life. To eradicate their so-called savage ways, the native children were punished for speaking their native languages, banned from participating in tribal dances and ceremonies or buffalo hunts with families, stripped of traditional clothing and hair, fed completely different food, required to reverse their traditional gender roles, and even forced to give up their given names for white names. Bill Wright, a Padawan Indian who was sent to boarding school at age 6, recalls,
And I remember coming home, and, then my grandma asked me to talk Indian to me, and I told her, Grandma, I don't understand you. She says, then who are you? I went, my name's Billy. She said, your name's not Billy. She said, your name is Tatum. That's who you are. That's your name. And I went, not what they told me.
Zikala Saw, a Lakota woman who entered a Quaker Indian boarding school at age 8, reflects, I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Our mothers had taught us that only unskilled warriors who were captured had their hair shingled by the enemy. I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me, for now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder. These indigenous children were intentionally and systematically shamed for being Indian in ways that have caused psychological damage that continues today. Indian students isolated for years were unable to fully reintegrate with their own people, but were not accepted as fully white either. The legacy of Indian boarding schools is grossly racist and unfortunately all too similar to many of the forms of oppression we have learned about in class. Yet the irony is that Quakers saw themselves as the reformers of their time and called themselves friends to the Indians. How do we reconcile this Quaker ideology with the forced assimilation of Indian boarding schools? How do the values of equality, simplicity, peace, and community get warped to oppressive ends? Quakers actually wanted to protect indigenous people from the government and white settlers who wanted to take advantage of them. They were against the government's dishonesty in taking native land unfairly through misleading treaties that natives could not read. Moreover, their peaceful ideology opposed the government exterminating native people through violent genocide. Quakers saw themselves as rejecting the ideas of social Darwinism that justified the decline of the inferior races in favor of the natural selection of the white superior races, by arguing that natives did not have to die out because they could be civilized and saved from their savagery. Ironically, Quakers saw themselves as helping indigenous peoples against the cruelty of the, quote, white man, as in the words of Quaker teacher Mary Lightfoot, to protect, to civilize, and to Christianize our red brethren. It is the duty we owe them, that we may help in a degree to make up for the cruelty and wrongs they have received at the hands of the white man, if that can ever be done. In that quote, you can see how good intentions get warped to oppressive ends. The problem is that, like many of the white savior colonial logics we've studied in this class, the Quakers' idea of helping, or rather saving, the native reflected a clearly paternalistic Euro-Christian supremacist attitude. And thus, although Quakers saw themselves as reformers against the goals of the government, Quakers actually were complicit with the government's goals of colonial control. For the U.S. government, the true purpose of Indian boarding schools was to eliminate Native Americans as a threat to white settlers by destroying their sense of self as indigenous people. Quaker Indian boarding schools were clearly a national settler colonial project, and claims to being reformers aside, the Quakers' paternalistic, racist attitudes led them to contribute to this agenda while thinking that they were caring and helping Native peoples. So knowing what we know now, where do we go from here? Palmer, NARF, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and a host of others have called for recognition of the truth as a first step to redress the harm caused by the policy of forced assimilation in Indian boarding schools. Obviously, the egregious harms done were not just the fault of the Quakers, but the fault of all parties involved at the time, as well as the nation as a whole for promoting the national project. Furthermore, it is clear that the injustice done is not left in the past, but continues on today in psychological, cultural, political, and economic injustices for Native Americans. However, I think the first step for healing could be for Swarthmore as an institution to recognize the involvement of Quakers in Quaker Indian boarding schools somehow, to bring more truth to the dominant narrative at this institution that places our Quaker roots on a golden pedestal.